people are doing. So now you might be wondering, why am I making a comparison with the S23 of all phones, because the S24 is out? Well, I know that, but there are two reasons. First and foremost, I still have the S23 Ultra, so why not? And secondly, the S23 Ultra obviously has issues, and I want to identify those issues and basically set them in stone so that I know exactly where the S24 Ultra needs to improve. Now, whether or not the S24 will do that or not, who knows? We'll find out when it shows up, which will be fairly soon if you really think about it. But yeah, this is going to set the stage for the S24 Ultra. It's the perfect comparison for us to set our expectations. And well, with that said, let's jump in. So firstly, I want to address the whole color profile situation on the X100. This is a vivid color profile, and as you can tell, very vivid. Now the S23 doesn't exactly have any color profiles, so to speak, but in this case, somehow, and unlike any other photograph I've taken in this entire comparison, it looks insanely natural on the S23. I mean, the colors are beyond realistic, and I don't know how or exactly why that happened, but it did. And it's insane because even with the X100's Zeiss natural colors, that's right, Zeiss natural colors, I think the S23 is actually looking more realistic. There are very few phones, if any at all, that can look more realistic, even in nuanced situations, as compared to X100's Zeiss natural colors. It's a feat, and it's only a one-time thing, but it's still quite something. Now, my personal opinion is that we should just continue using Zeiss natural colors, but this is the textured mode on the X100, which I guess it works, sure, but you know, it's only for very specific situations where this level of contrast and depth and colors and lower exposure is actually going to be beneficial. I don't think that's going to be the case in most situations. I know this one, slightly backlit, not completely ridiculous or anything like that. We'll get to that stuff soon. But I think this is how the S23 is supposed to look, because here you can see more vibrance, less contrast, more detail in the shadows. That's just essentially a safer color profile that the S23 uses, if you want to put it like that. The X100 goes for more contrast, less vibrance, more of a natural look, and my personal preference goes to the X100 easily. Now then, a main camera close-up, and this is very backlit, and it's a very difficult shot because the lighting in front that's falling on the subject, it's very warm light, and the lighting in the background is white. So it needs to have, the phones that is, they need to have very good balance, which they do. And that doesn't exactly surprise me because both the S23 and the X100 can handle situations like this very easily, which goes to show that they can handle pretty much anything. And yeah, I know I kind of messed up the framing in the previous shot, and in here with the X100 I took the textured mode, and it was kind of to test out and see if maybe in these kinds of indoors lighting, maybe that's where you want to use textured mode. And I guess it works. It gives a very stylish, very high contrast shot that doesn't look obscene, so to speak. And yeah, I think there are definitely situations where the textured mode on the X100 does work, and you can experiment with it if you want. Now for the ultrawide, this is where things are gonna get interesting. Not yet, because with the daylight shots, it's good on both. It's gonna be fantastic on the S23. It has more than enough in the software side alone to make up for not particularly good hardware. It's at night where things get hairy. But I do want to draw attention to one thing. The X100's colors are so unbelievably perfect, or believably perfect. It works really well. The Zeiss natural colors, by far my favorite color profile on any smartphone so far. Now, slightly backlit ultrawide, and you can see the colors on the X100, they are about as perfect, about as close to reality as it could get, because when I took this shot, it's basically how it looked. As you can see the colors on the X100. The S23, you can see it's not quite the same, but the contrast on the S23, now that is something I like a lot. Even in the previous shot, we had fairly good contrast and more brightness. In this case, it's even more exaggerated. I think it looks even better. So honestly, I can't pick between the two at this point. Even with this very harshly backlit ultrawide, you can see the S23 is just nailing the contrast. I really like the contrast with the ultrawide on the S23 at least, because on the X100, as much as I like the near 100% realism with the colors, I still think it's lacking a bit in the contrast. Just a little, not too much, but it's definitely a lot more appealing on the S23 Ultra with the higher contrast, and it just looks so much nicer to my eyes. But of course, with the ultrawides, you can also take macro, and macro comes in two very unique flavors on the X100 Pro. So with the ultrawide, I think both are very close, but you can use the telephoto camera, which is a fantastic high quality telephoto on the X100, and with just the regular opticals, which is a 4.3x optical zoom on the X100, you don't really get, you know, incredible macro. It's good macro, it's alright macro at best, but it's not incredible. So when you use the 9.6x kind of a hybrid zoom with the telephoto, that's when things get impressive. See, you can get basically as close as the S23, but you get no distortion, and you get a ton of depth of field, a ton of background bokeh and blur. And it's a different shot entirely. And the fact that you get this level of versatility, that's quite impressive. You know, it's kind of like a feature that I never even knew I wanted. But now for a zoom. So the X100 Pro does have sensor crop, which is a 2x from the main camera, and the S23 doesn't really use that. Because if we crop into 500%, you can see that with 2x, the X100 has way less noise, way less oversharpening and processing, whilst maintaining basically the same level of detail. Yes, there's some artifacting in some of the finer details, but it's definitely better than the S23. At 3x, well, naturally the S23's optical zoom kicks in, and that's a very good high quality optical zoom, so the X100 doesn't really stand much of a chance in this case. I did zoom in and check, the details are definitely better on the S23. But at 4.3x, and of course this is where the X100's optical zoom kicks in, and that does produce a ton of detail. It's a massively high quality sensor that we have, and it does an incredible job, to say the very least. Then of course 10x. See, this is where things are going to be interesting. So the S23 does have optical zoom, but the sensor is not as high quality as the sensor that is being used on the 4.3x on the X100. So in essence, you will get very similar levels of detail. At 10x you may not be able to see any difference, but at 30x you can see that both are basically the same. There's very minor levels of difference in like brightness and contrast, because I see slightly more brightness on the S23 and also a little bit more grain. The X100 is just crushing shadows a little bit more, but also a little bit cleaner. That's kind of the situation here. Now with high-res, see, this is where things are going to be very interesting. So both have very different approaches to high-res. The S23 Ultra goes all in with the main camera. The X100, this one likes to go for high-res with every single rear camera that we have, and that's honestly absolutely fantastic, because the 50 megapixels on the X100 is phenomenal, to say the least, because when we crop in, you can see even though the S23 is technically a 200 megapixel camera that is binning down into 50 megapixels, it's not even coming close to the level of detail that the X100 has. And yes, a part of that is because of the higher contrast on the X100. It just makes the details pop out that much more. But of course, we gotta test out the raw 200 megapixels. That's gotta be something, right? It's gotta do better. Well, it does better than the 50 megapixels, but you know, with just the amount of hassle that you gotta go through with 200 megapixels, the fact that it takes up a whole boatload of storage, I don't know, it's producing as much detail as the X100, which is just a 50 megapixel shot. Now the ultrawide, again with 50 megapixels on the X100, and I don't know why, but the S23 decided to crush the shadows this time a lot. But of course, that is all irrelevant, because we gotta crop in and take a look at the details. I'll tell you this much, for 12 megapixels, this is an impressive shot on the S23 Ultra. I do see a lot more oversharpening and processing as opposed to the X100, but the detail preservation is pretty much the same, which is, again, very, very impressive. The software is doing so much heavy lifting, you can pretty much see it right here. But unfortunately, the software can only do so much. We'll get to why I say that. But before that, we have, of course, the 4.3x with 50 megapixels on the X100 once again. Now, of course, with 4.3x, you don't really have any optical zoom in that range with the S23 Ultra. And so, of course, the X100, when we crop in, has much more detail. But I did want to test out just how much does the optical 10x give the S23 an advantage, as opposed to the high-res 4.3x on the X100. So this is a 10x on the S23 Ultra that is zoomed in around 250%, as opposed to the 500% crop on the X100. So, you know, the crop is the same. And the details, I actually think there's a bit more sharpness on the S23 Ultra. Now then with selfies, so I want to switch things up. I want to see how well both of these can perform in indoors lighting. And this is a very warm lit situation. You can see it just from the photos alone. And I think the S23 is doing a much better job here. It's just simply giving me so much more contrast. It looks so much better. Just look at the background. It looks faded on the X100. I think this is kind of a bad shot on the X100. Usually it performs way better, and you can see right here why I say that. It's simply so much better, even with a backlit situation. So I think the previous shot was kind of a mess up on the X100 spot. Both are doing a fantastic job. I think the S23 still has a little bit more contrast, just a tiny pinch. But overall, I think the X100 is basically just as good. I do want to point out that the S23 is sharpening my face more. It doesn't have more detail, that's not quite the right term yet. The X100 is not doing that, which I kind of prefer, especially when it comes to faces at least. Yeah, look, the HDR performance on the X100 is significantly better as opposed to the S23. Yeah, that much is more than clear. Also, I didn't even mention it till now, the X100 has a much wider field of view, which I prefer by leagues as opposed to the S23 Ultra. I really like having a wider field of view, even though I don't actually take selfies almost at all. Alright, then now let's take a look at portrait selfies. So this was in just stark white lighting. The light was behind me, as you would expect from my comparisons. Now, the skin tones, that's definitely something I prefer on the X100. And once again, the S23 is sharpening things on my face, like the details are just popping out immediately. Now, I don't know if you would prefer that or not, but personally, maybe it's because I'm looking at this on a bigger screen and it just feels more sharpened to me, and you might not even see any of that when you look at it on YouTube on maybe a smartphone or something like that. Now, here's a real challenging one, and wow, the HDR is maybe a little too good on the X100. It's not even considering the chandelier in the background to be a highlight, like you see on the S23 Ultra. That's unexpected, to say the least. Now, I do think that the edge detection is messing up just a pinch. Just look above my ear and you can see that a bit of the curtain is not being blurred out. Now, that could be because, you know, the angle isn't quite the same. So there's a chance of that, of course, and you know, these things, they happen. There's nothing you can do about it, to be honest. Now, of course, I wasn't gonna leave you hanging. I have a backlit by the sun selfie portrait, and yeah, I do like the X100 a little bit more. I think the colors of the sunset, it looks a bit more realistic, and I like the slightly higher contrast on the X100. That's the biggest reason, that the colors are a very minor difference. It doesn't even matter, to be entirely honest. It's a higher contrast that I really like. Now, night selfies, see, usually I take my night selfies in much darker situations, but I realize that that's not even close to realistic, because if anyone's gonna take a selfie at night, it's gonna be in regular low light situation. And this is a regular low light situation where, of course, the S23 Ultra is gonna excel. It has the best night selfie that I've ever taken in any smartphone. The X100, usually I say it's horrible, but as it turns out, in not particularly horrible situations and regular low light, I guess it's fine. As a similar story with selfie night portraits, that's a feature that I don't think I've ever seen in any other smartphone, at least among the ones I've ever used. The X100, it's not horrible considering that it didn't even take a long exposure, but the S23 is again leagues ahead. Now when it comes to regular portraits, see, it's simple for me. The S23 it looks fantastic in this case. It's a 1x zoom shot, nothing wrong with it, but the contrast on the X100 and the very realistic skin tones on the X100, it really works for me. And this is a backlit portrait. I don't know what happened on the S23. It's going just absolutely batshit crazy on the blur. I didn't change the blur level as opposed to the previous shot, but you can see the blur is way more intense as opposed to what we have before, or even what we have on the X100. And this right here. So I'm using 2x on the S23 because that's the only medium zoom range you get outside of the 3x. And on the X100 you get a 35mm, which is around 1.5x zoom, and I think that's a fantastic zoom level. And with just how high quality the X100's portraits and main camera shots are, the 1.5x crop, it's not really going to even allow you to lose any detail, and that kind of stands in this case. Also, the dynamic range is actually better on the X100. Now, of course, the X100 can also do a 2x, which is 50mm. And again, two very simple reasons why I like the X100 more in this case is that the X100 has more contrast and slightly more natural, nicer looking skin tones. It just edges out the S23, and I do hope that the skin tones at least get resolved on the S24 Ultra. Now, of course, a backlit 2x on the X100, and both have some of their issues. Like the X100 has better highlight preservation, the S23 has a little bit of a flat look with less contrast, while the X100 also has a bit of a desaturated look. So there's a whole bunch of things going on here. Now then, 85mm, so this is like a 3.5 or 3.7x crop from the main camera on the X100, and somehow, I don't know what kind of voodoo this baby does, but it's able to produce basically as much detail as the S23 Ultra's, again very high quality, 3x optical zoom. Now, I do think there's a bit more sharpness on the S23 once again, just like we had in the selfies, but also there's a lot more grain, while the X100 has a bit more smoothing in my skin. But the details in like my beard and my hair, it's actually higher on the X100 as opposed to the S23. Now, of course, you can go all the way to 100mm on the X100 Pro, which is 4.3x optical. S23 has nothing as such. The S24 actually has a 5x, and I'll test it when it shows up. But anyways, I think the 100mm is absolutely fantastic on the X100. It works exceptionally well. It gives you some of the most pleasing looking portraits as you can ever hope. Now finally we have night portraits. Both of these phones are absolutely phenomenal with night portraits. Like, there are very few phones that can actually compete. And I think the S23, it looks fantastic. I kind of like the higher contrast once again, as usual, on the X100 Pro. Now finally, with regular night mode, and look, I cleaned the lens. It somehow, for some reason, the S23 just looks horrible. I guess horrible is a bit harsh, but still, like the X100, just look at how much more crisp and clean it looks as opposed to the S23 Ultra. Not to mention the detail preservation is on a whole different level as opposed to the S23 Ultra. These are with the main cameras, and somehow the S23 just isn't working out, which I'm not even sure why that's the case. Even in this one, as I said again, I cleaned the lens, but it just kept giving me these weird faded images that do not look good. Also, the night sky. It's smooth on both, which is kind of an achievement on the S23 Ultra, which usually is never the case. But on the X100, I really like the gradient. That's how night skies should always be. The X100 can be a little inconsistent with night skies. I've talked about it in previous comparisons, but in this case, I think it's doing a phenomenal job. Now, I went indoors and took an ultra low light shot, as anyone would in their right mind when making a camera comparison between these two. The right mind part is subjective. But regardless, as you can see, in ultra low light, somehow the S23 Ultra is working. How could it not handle regular low light night mode situations, but it can do an exceptional job, basically just as good as the X100 in ultra low light. Now the ultrawide camera, see, the main camera, I don't know what the problem was there, but the ultrawide is just, it's horrible at night because the software can only do so much, and the software can handle things as long as you have light. The moment that goes, so does the quality, down the drain. Because do I even need to explain why the X100 is monumentally ahead of the S23 Ultra here? I don't think so. Even in this case, where I would say we have plenty of light, and yes, see, this is where I was saying the X100 night sky can sometimes brighten up a little too much. In this case, I think it's maybe a touch too bright. The S23's night sky is somehow doing a good job, but the rest of it, the details, the weird greenish yellow warmth that we're getting as opposed to the more natural warmth on the X100, yeah, it doesn't work. Yeah, the details are the biggest problem in my opinion. Now then for the zoom. So 2x, interestingly enough, the X100 is using sensor crop and it is doing a phenomenal job, no question. But the S23 Ultra, which it doesn't use sensor crop, so you're not gonna get a lot of detail if you try to use 2x, but you see, once again, it's messing up and it's giving us weird flat result that doesn't look good at all. It's very faded. Even though previously in the ultra low light, it managed to give us a perfect, very beautiful high contrast shot. And it immediately fixes itself the moment I go to 3x, which uses the optical zoom. And of course, as opposed to the X100, which doesn't have optical zoom, at night at least the S23 is going to do a significantly better job. Although I do want to point out, the white balance is a little weird on both. So the S23 is overcompensating. We had warm lights. It looks like they're white. While the X100 is giving us way too much warmth. It looks like there's a wildfire going on somewhere very close. But then when we go to 4.3x, this is where the X100's optical zoom kicks in, and yeah, now apparently it decided to take inspiration from the S23 Ultra and once again screw with the white balance. And 10x. Now 10x was interesting. So the S23 did take it with the 10x optical zoom, which it usually doesn't use optical zoom at night, but in this case it did. Bloody miracle. And secondly, I don't know why, but the details are good on the S23, but somehow the road has no texture. I don't know why it's smoothing it out so damn much. I think it's mistaking the texture for grain somehow. Maybe that's a problem with the software, because it looks far more cohesive on the X100, even though it's technically a massive crop. after the 4.3x optical. Now the moon. Man, I finally got a moon for the X100 Pro. The damn thing was eluding me the entire last week. But anyways, so the S23 Ultra, maybe because it has a 10x optical, I'm not entirely sure because 50% of these images are usually AI generated, but yeah, the X100 doesn't have as much detail as the S23 Ultra. The 100x looks like garbage on the S23. I don't know why that's the case. It looks worse than the 30x. I think I know why that might be the case. I took like 10 shots of the same damn moon and it came out exactly the same. The X100 is doing a significantly better job, but I think somehow the S23 software cannot really recognize that this is a moon, and that's why it's not able to process it as such. And so that is a wrap for this comparison, and I do believe there are quite a few things the S24 Ultra needs to fix. The S23 Ultra, especially for such a high-priced, high-caliber, high-expectation flagship, is gotta be good, right? That's kind of the thing. And the S24 Ultra, with all the AI stuff, I'm hoping that the software actually gets more consistent, that we get better and more consistent results. I do hope that's the case at least. As far as I know, the S24 Ultra's ultra-wide camera is not anything new, so that does concern me, but you know, maybe software will compensate. If it does, then fantastic, bloody hell, I'm gonna rejoice, hallelujah. But if it doesn't, then it's gonna be a very rocky road for the S24 Ultra, because I really like ultrawides. I really like ultrawide night, but I think they're phenomenal if they come out properly, like they do on the X100, but they don't on the S23. So yeah, with those said, I do think that the S24 Ultra, when it shows up, is gonna be bloody amazing. I'll be seeing you guys soon with those. Cheers.